Greetings et bienvenue. I'm Stephen Saideman, Director of the Canadian Defense and Security Network and Paterson Chair in International Affairs at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. To mark the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we decided to bring together a range of Canadians, from those who were in decision-making positions on that day to observers of Canadian politics and policy across the country these days, and ask them what they remember of that day, what they thought of Canada's reactions, and what they think we can learn from what went well and what went poorly over the past 20 years. While this project was underway, the government of Canada faced a real crisis in that the folks that we were supporting in Afghanistan fell. And so many of our interviews were conducted before these events. So take that into consideration as you watch the videos, the interviews in the next few minutes. Before going further, I should note that the CDSN is based at Carleton University, which is located on the unceded Algonquin territory, which is home to the Anishinaabe Nation. I will return at the end of this video to share my 9/11 story, as well as the lessons I've learned, and to thank those who did all the hard work to make this video possible.
On the 11th of September 2001, I was actually in Hungary, having just landed there from Italy on what is called the Military Committee Tour. And the Military Committee Tour is a gathering of chiefs of defense of NATO on an annual basis. And it's hosted by a different country every year. I happen to have taken over as Chief of Defense Staff on the 28th of June 2001, so I was fairly new to the NATO Chiefs of Defense Forum, and had participated in this particular meeting, the 2001 meeting, first in Italy, where we were given capability demonstrations by their Air Force and their Navy in particular, and we're en route to Hungary for our first meeting of the NATO Chiefs of Defense Forum, the military committee capability, in Hungary that afternoon. And this was an important thing for Hungary, because they had just joined NATO a few years earlier in 1998, I'm sorry. And so this was a very important day for them. We landed in Hungary about 4 o'clock in the afternoon local time on the 11th of September. And of course, as soon as the aircraft touched down with the time change between there and New York, the cell phones started to go off, especially our aides de camp and different administrative staff that were on board the aircraft with us. It was a Boeing 737 with pretty much all of the chiefs of defense on board, except for the American Chief of Defense, or Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who was on his way in his own aircraft from the US and was going to be joining us in Hungary a little bit later on. So when we got off the aircraft, there was a recognition through the phone calls that there had been an incident in New York. And it was obvious that an aircraft had crashed into one of the Twin Towers, but it wasn't very obvious yet whether or not it was a big aircraft, a small aircraft, just a pilot who had lost his way, if you like. So we carried on with the routine, which was a military parade, or a welcoming parade, and then we were making our ways to the buses to go downtown into the hotels and to start the actual meetings of the military committee in Hungary that afternoon or that evening. And then the cell phones started to go off again. And then it was obvious that a second aircraft had crashed into the towers. And now it was becoming more obvious that this was more than just an accident that was unpredictable, obviously, but something of a benign nature. So we all gathered as soon as we got to the hotel in the meeting room. The American military committee member, the permanent representative of the U.S., who was an Air Force officer, gave us a rundown on what he knew about the towers and what had happened. And it wasn't very long after that, obviously, that things started to really deteriorate. The towers came down, and it was clear to all of us who were there, all of the chiefs of defense, that we needed to get back to our own individual countries, especially knowing that the airspace was being closed, especially on the North American continent, and the travel between Europe and North America was being restricted quite significantly. So we all tried to make arrangements to do what we could to get back home. In my case, it was fortunate that the Minister of Defense at the time, Minister Eggleton, happened to be in Bulgaria, signing a training agreement with their government. and he was there with a military Challenger aircraft. So we were able to get a hold of him. He agreed to come and pick me up in Hungary, and we were going to Brussels immediately afterwards. We did that, arriving in Brussels pretty much in the middle of the night. And the next morning, I attended the meeting of the NATO ambassadors, which was being chaired by the Canadian NATO permanent representative, David Wright, who was the dean of ambassadors at the time. So that was a very revealing meeting. It was very clear during that meeting that the U.S. was reluctant to declare that it was an attack on the U.S. from without, because they were still reeling from the Oklahoma bombings, as most will recall. And so it was agreed that before Article 5, which is a very important article of NATO, an attack against one is an attack against all, is what Article 5 understands and promotes. It was agreed that the U.S. would ensure that the attack had come from without before asking for Article 5 to be declared. So that was how we broke up. During the middle of that night, my aide-de-camp, who was a very capable and very knowledgeable guy, actually found an aircraft that could get us back to Canada the next day. And in fact, that's what happened. That aircraft repositioned to Brussels. We put out the word that it was going back to Canada at 5 o'clock Brussels time that afternoon. And so on September 12th, we all loaded up. It was about a half full aircraft, maybe a 2/3 full aircraft. Many people were in Europe doing the normal fall visits and so on that are part of what we do from a global affairs and a military point of view. So there were several military officers on board. There was me and the Minister of National Defense, several deputy ministers and other senior officials from departments and so on. And we arrived back in Ottawa about 6 o'clock local time on the 12th of September. So that was my day on the 11th of September. Thankfully, my Vice Chief of Defense, Lieutenant General George MacDonald, was the acting Chief of Defense Staff back in Canada. He was taking care of the coordination between departments alongside the Deputy Minister and other government officials, of course, who were responding to the terrorist attack. And I was in contact with the Prime Minister and the Minister on a fairly regular basis, of course, the Minister directly, and the Prime Minister by phone until I got back the next day. And then we carried on with the response requested by the Government of Canada to the attacks. There are some things that really do stick in your mind, obviously. And the first one for me was the meeting of the ambassadors of NATO that next morning. That meeting was very sobering. What was very important about that meeting is that it was chaired by a Canadian. And David Wright did a magnificent job of chairing that meeting. The American ambassador was very eloquent that day, and also very sure of what he and his nation needed to do to ensure what the nature of the terrorist attack was. And it was clear that the ambassadors were all united in the response that needed to ultimately be taken if it was an attack from outside the U.S. And so that for me was very important, because that again defined the next stage of my career, which was to be the chairman of the NATO Military Committee later on, and this was in 2005. And I had seen already how well the NATO mechanism, if you like, especially at the North Atlantic Council level, could operate in a crisis. And I was very encouraged by that. And I might say that may have been one of the things that actually incited me to actually compete as a chairman of the military committee a few years later, because I really had a very strong place in my heart for NATO and what it represented. And what the ambassadors did that day, I thought, was exactly what you would expect of NATO ambassadors, who really are very committed to solidarity of NATO as one of the key principles of the alliance, and something that keeps the alliance together and doing what it does so well as a regional defense organization, a political and military defense organization. So that to me was something quite memorable. The second thing, and I've mentioned this to others in the past, is that the next day when we gathered everyone for the aircraft, the trip back to Ottawa, it was quite unique because airspace had been shut down, as I think most are aware of. Everybody would have been aware by then. We had airliners all over the Canadian territory, from coast to coast, having been diverted with the closure of U.S. airspace. And so the North Atlantic tracks, or the tracks from Europe to North America and vice versa, were pretty much empty on the 12th of September. And we had to get special permission, of course, to make that trip from Europe back to Canada. And it was a relatively sobering experience. I remember going up into the cockpit, talking to the aircraft crew, one of which was a United Kingdom or a British exchange pilot, and a Canadian pilot, of course, on board. And they said to me, you know, this is very, very quiet on board this aircraft today. The North Atlantic track is pretty much empty. We don't see any contrails out there. We're pretty much on our own here over the Atlantic. And they said, this is what Lindbergh must have felt like when he was making his crossing, of course, at a much different time, in a different direction, but very, very lonely that day. The next thing that happened, of course, is we penetrated the Canadian and Continental Air Defense Identification Zone. And as we were coming up to the identification zone, it was clear that our track, the North Atlantic track, which is a very common one and one that's assigned to aircraft doing that type of route, would take us through the northeast edge of American airspace, specifically through Millinocket, through Maine. And the pilots called me up to the cockpit and said, we've been told by our en route air traffic controller that we're going to have to change our route, otherwise we could risk being intercepted and who knows, even being shot down because of the closure of airspace and so on. So they asked me what I thought we should do, and I said, well, I think you should turn north right now. That really only added about 5 or 10 minutes to our flying time, but it was a very significant and sobering experience in its own right as well, because it made it very clear that there was absolutely no quarter to be given on what had happened. The terrorist attack was obvious. The death and destruction that had occurred was very, very clear in everybody's mind. And here we were being rerouted for all the right reasons, of course, on that fateful trip back to Ottawa. When we landed, of course, there were no aircraft at the aircraft docks, or if there were, they were stationary. All of the vehicles that were there waiting for us to pick us up, the different officials and so on, all the black staff cars and so on were on the ramp. But it was like sort of like being in a Steven Spielberg movie in some ways, because of the intensity of the moment. So those are the two things that stick in my mind the most for that day. And of course, the knowledge that it was going to be something that I was going to have to deal with very significantly from then on in as the new Chief of Defense Staff.
9/11, I was in Toronto awaiting cancer surgery. And as I watched the events unfold that morning, I knew that my surgery would be canceled because Sunnybrook Hospital was an international trauma center. And by the end of the day, or later on in the day, we realized that there would be no survivors to be sent to a trauma hospital. So it seared in my mind for many reasons. I had my parents with me as I was preparing for surgery. And my father, of course, a World War II vet, said, "This is Pearl Harbor." And I think that it instantly put it in perspective for me, from someone with that age and vantage, that this was an attack on the American homeland like none we had seen since then, and that we did not know where and how far widespread. Would it be next cities? Would it be across our country? Would it be in the US? Would it be internationally? It was frightening at its very core. It was a human story that nobody could even comprehend at that point, as we watched those buildings fall and the people trying to make their way, those that had survived, make their way through the dust and the dirt, their faces covered. It was such a powerful sense of vulnerability that I think it stays with those of us who were paying attention. And then, of course, subsequently, I moved to New York. So it just is, it was a moment in time that I certainly will never forget. And the enormity of the human tragedy is imprinted on my mind. I stay in touch, of course, with many of the widows and families of those who lost a loved one. And it will never leave me. I was approached, I was doing my television show, and we were asked, I had my own company, we were asked if we would go down to New York and do all the logistics and manage and broadcast something called Canada Loves New York. So this started out to be a very small event. There were going to be a couple of hundred people go down, present the mayor of New York with a painting by Charlie Pachter of the two flags intertwined, and a few police and firemen would send representatives and reach out. By the time we arrived in New York in October to do this event, and I was hosting the event, one of my producers said to me, "Go outside, Pam, and walk around and take a look." So this was at the Roseland Ballroom in New York. Canadians were lined up for 4 city blocks. There were more than 20,000 Canadians who had come on their own steam. They had driven, they had come in a plane, however they'd gotten there. And it was a powerful statement of friendship and love and support. Of course, we lost Canadians as well that day. Some of that knowledge was still uncertain, but the response, the family to family, the human to human was wonderful. The political response was less than impressive, and I think puzzled and perhaps even hurt our friends and allies in the United States. When I came back to Canada and was eventually appointed to the Senate, one of my most important accomplishments, as I look back on it, was to have the National Day of Service recognized officially on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. This is what will be a living and ongoing tribute to the Canadian families who lost a loved one on 9/11. This is a way where anybody can quietly engage in an act of kindness, small and quietly, as we saw happen literally hundreds of thousands of times in New York in the days afterwards, where shop owners would stand on the street and offer those folks trying to make their way home in bare feet a bottle of water or a pair of shoes. It was just so powerful. And we have now, that is now law in Canada, the National Day of Service. And I think that will be the ongoing tribute to what occurred that day in both our countries and what it means for all of those touched by this event going forward.
Well, on 9/11, I was on a tour of countries in East Europe as Minister of Defense. Parliament wasn't sitting at the time. NATO had been discussing expansion or enlargement, I think they called it. And on 9/11, I was at the second country on the tour, which was Sofia, Bulgaria, where I was to address a group of people, a couple of hundred people, who were involved in, I think it was called the North Atlantic Society, something to that effect. Anyway, these were people that were interested in becoming involved in NATO, were interested in moving Bulgaria towards the West. And they were anxious to hear what I had to say about their chances of becoming a member of NATO and what I thought they needed to do to prepare themselves for that possibility and to try to get acceptance by the NATO membership. So I was walking into the hotel, and one of my assistants came up to me and said a plane had crashed into one of the World Trade Center towers in New York. And I was kind of astonished about that. But my thinking at the time was this is probably an accident. So I proceeded on into the building and into the waiting room before I went in to address the people who had come to hear me talk about NATO and Bulgaria's chances of joining. And it wasn't long thereafter when the assistant came up to me and said, a plane had gone into one of the other towers at the World Trade Center. Well, I knew then that this was not an accident, and there was something enormous happening on what was the other side of the world at that point in time. And so I started to contemplate what I was going to tell these people, because the whole picture was changing very rapidly. How relevant was the speech that I came to give? I decided I should proceed anyway to go in, and I started talking to these people, and I talked about what was happening in New York right at the very beginning. They looked a little puzzled because I think they'd been sitting there for long enough that they were out of contact with media and out of contact with what was happening in New York. But I said to them that there's something happening here that is going to require us to rethink a lot of our defense arrangements, and that we will have to consider all of that pretty soon. So I then proceeded to get into my speech because I really didn't know what the end result would be of all of it. And these people had come to listen to me talk about becoming a member, their country becoming a member of NATO. So after I gave my remarks, I returned to the adjacent room where they had CNN going, and I was hearing all about what was happening, and I immediately said that we should get out and go back home. Even though there was a dinner, the Minister of Defense for Bulgaria was hosting a dinner for me that evening, but I said, no, I think we better go back home. So we had a military aircraft and military pilots, etc., on standby, and we then started to prepare to go home. And then I got a call from our ambassador to NATO in Brussels, who knew I was in Sofia, and he suggested I might come to Brussels because the NATO Council was going to meet the following day, and it was going to consider, for the very first time, the declaration of Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which says an attack on one is an attack on all, and we come to the defense of one of our member NATO countries. So I decided at that point that rather than going home, I would go to Brussels. And so I went to Brussels and got there the next morning, and we went into session to consider Article 5, which was in fact declared for the very first time. And under circumstances we never had foreseen that Article 5 would be declared. And at that point in time, there were some of my colleagues and other people, Canadians who were part of the government, who were in Europe and wanted to come back home. So we started our trip back home. And I remember as we were going over the Atlantic Ocean, the pilot calling me up and saying, here, I want you to come and hear this. So I go in and I said, well, I don't hear anything. And he said, well, that's the point. There's no air traffic control. There's no sound at all going. We're about the only one in the air. We're a military aircraft, and therefore we could, but there was absolutely no traffic with respect to commercial operations or passengers in commercial flights at that time, as I subsequently found out coming home. The subsequent to that, we dealt with legislation in the Parliament of Canada and trying to find ways of ensuring that terrorism didn't take a foothold in our own country. And so we developed legislation that would help to do that. It was a difficult task because there was the need for people's safety and security on the one hand, but also we had to be very careful about people's civil liberties. So I think we came up with the right balance at the time. I don't know how much of that has been followed in recent years, but certainly we took the action to try to secure the safety and security of our country without too much loss of civil liberties.
I was in a meeting in my office, in my boardroom actually. We were actually doing a briefing for the new head of CSE at the time, when somebody said to me that there's been an incident in New York, and I went and turned on CNN. Oddly enough, about a week before that meeting in the CSIS building with the new chief of CSE, there had been a meeting of deputy ministers in the security community, chaired by PCO up in Meech Lake, sort of get together and review where we were. And the chair of the meeting, I think it was Margaret Purdy at the time, Margaret went around the room and asked people what they thought, and finally landed on me. And I said, this is a week before, I guess, not as prescient as it sounds, because it was in a context of a lot of stuff going on. I said, look, there's a lot of chatter. The Americans expect an attack in the very near future. Everybody is on the alert. Everybody expects one now, given the amount of chatter on the lines. I mean, the reality of the response to the specific attack, I mean, I think most people, at least those who were conscious at that point, know of what happened, know that it caused an immediate shutdown in air traffic, and planes were landing all over the place in Gander and on these other places in the East Coast. There was an enormous demand on the system. One of the worst things for Canada is obviously an attack in Canada, but an attack on the United States that comes from Canada ranks right up there as well. And so there was an enormous effort in a very short period after the attack to discover where and how these people had arrived in the United States, and to make sure, to the extent we could, that they had not come through Canada, which we were actually able to do relatively quickly. Not that changed some people's minds in the United States, who still think they all came through Canada or somewhere else. But we did not come through Canada. That had been an attack entirely focused on the United States, and entirely by people who had legally entered the United States. The aftermath of the attack, closing, or the semi-closing of the border, if you will, and all of the impact that had. And for example, auto plants on both sides of the border shut down because of just-in-time deliveries, because the border shipments were all blocked up. So the auto industry ground to a halt within a couple of days, because they couldn't put cars together without parts from somewhere else. So it had an enormous impact in the short term. Terrorism in Canada didn't start on September the 11th. People forget that it goes back a long way. You can go back all the way back to the Fenians in the early days of Canada around Confederation, to look for terrorism in Canada. We had our own with the FLQ, and we also had our own in an odd sense with the Babar Khalsa, the Sikh extremist group, which was responsible for bringing down Air India and an attack on an Air India flight landing at Narita, and a couple of other assassination attempts in Canada. So terrorism in Canada is not new. We've always had a large number of terrorist organizations that have one reason or another.
On 9/11, I was actually in high school. I remember being at the Tim Hortons during one of my spares with some friends of mine. And I remember there was a small TV screen in the Tim Hortons that everyone was gathered around.
Like everyone else in that Thames, we didn't know the true gravity of what was happening, and were under the impression that maybe it was a grave accident, completely unintentional. In the days following, as more information became available, fear, suspicion, paranoia emerged, and it became prevalent both in our high school and our community. I felt this first as a Muslim in Canada. As we discovered that the Taliban were harboring those responsible for the attacks, I felt the xenophobia increase as an Afghan Canadian. In tandem with the US and UK reactions and changes to community policing, we witnessed more firsthand how these policing and intelligence gathering methods focused on specific communities. For example, my brothers and father were regularly visited by the RCMP and CSIS. This created a sense of paranoia among the Muslim community, as there was a chance to cause issues, to report suspicious behavior, some of it justified and some of it not. Bills C-51, C-24, and S-7 sparked widespread controversy, as many felt they were disproportionately aimed at the Arab Muslim community. This was in addition to ongoing political rhetoric and the xenophobia. I explored this further during my doctorate research and in interviews with both Arab Muslims and non-Muslims. It became clear that there was a chilling effect on civil liberties as a result of some of these measures. However, since then, Canada has moved more towards a community-based policing measures through involving local communities as partners rather than subjects. We've also seen a softening of the rhetoric in both the political speeches and in the media and how we talk about terrorism, both domestic and international. This is also reflected in the gradual changes of domestic and international policies, which are also to a degree aligned with those of our partners in the UK, for example, the PREVENT strategy, the US, Australia, and New Zealand.
Who was looking out the window saw smoke over at the Pentagon, because we were sort of line of sight of the Pentagon where our embassy is located on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's a long way away, but it's not that far. And all of a sudden he saw black smoke coming up over the Pentagon, which is not a good sign, because black smoke means diesel aviation gas or aviation fuel. And we then learned very quickly that the Pentagon had been hit as well. I should also mention that the embassy is located about, a third of a mile, maybe half a kilometer, a bit more, in line of sight along Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol building. And of course, news reports started coming in that there was still another plane in the air. And I can't remember if it was at that point or slightly later that the concern was that plane might be looking for a target at the White House, which we are not that far from at the embassy, or at the Capitol building. Well, that was, of course, a plane that came down in Pennsylvania, thanks to the courageous actions of some of the passengers that overcame the pilot who'd taken over the plane, and sort of the plane crashed. So it was obviously very traumatic. Things started happening very quickly. Thing I remember sticks in my mind very prominently is the fact that Prime Minister Kergin phoned me shortly after 10 o'clock, as I recall. He was concerned how the embassy was doing, because he knew we were very close to Pentagon and the issues were important. And all of a sudden that view by the Americans changed. They said, God, there's 5,500 miles of undefended border, and people can just cross anytime. And of course, the story of the three, quote unquote, false story of the three terrorists coming across suddenly changed that perspective, that perception, if you will. And we then found ourselves in a situation where the border suddenly became much thicker, became a liability, no longer, Canada was a liability, no longer an asset in that respect. So this required some really fast work. And we were very fortunate at the time to have John Manley as our foreign minister, and a guy called Tom Ridge, who had been the governor of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania shares a short border with Canada. It's a northern state, knows Canada well. And Tom Ridge became, right after 9/11, became the first director, now a secretary position, cabinet position, but at the time it was a director in the White House of Homeland Security. And so he was in charge of border security, southern border and the northern border of the United States. But in light of 9/11, the first view of concern, because of these false stories, that Canada was the problem, not the solution. So we got within, I guess, 2 or 3 weeks of 9/11, we were able to arrange a meeting in the White House between John Manley and Tom Ridge to get together, say, how can we reinforce your northern border? What can we do to allay your concerns and to ensure that terrorists don't come into Canada and use the Canadian quote unquote porous border to do damage to the United States? Now, Tom Ridge and John Manley had not met before, but they got along extremely well. They both had a view of the importance of at that time, the internet. And Manley, when he'd been the Minister of, I guess, Industry Canada, had invested quite a bit in linking up Northern Canada through the internet, providing computers and internet connections to remote areas. And Ridge had done the same thing in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a very rural state in many areas. And as governor, he'd done that. So they had a lot to talk about, the importance of internet, of wireless, to deal with things. They were on the same page, roughly the same age, both had a very good sense of humor, and they both got along very well. So very quickly, they put together a really good team on both sides of the border. Manley had picked people out of the Privy Council office who had views and knowledge of a kind of whole of Canada approach to border management, and Ridge did the same thing.
And I had a class that morning from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. I remember it very clearly because if you know anything about 9/11, you know pretty much everything happened between 8 a.m. and 11 a.m. And it was an intensive 3.5-hour course or 3-hour course on Thomas Hobbes. You know, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, which was kind of weirdly appropriate. And I rolled in, this is a little bit before, you know, the technology we have now, and I'd rolled in a television. I must have shown some kind of segment, probably of an old VHS video, something related to Hobbes. And as I left the class, I had the television literally on one of those carts on wheels. I was wheeling it down to the media center. And as I was going through the hallways of Humber College, people were literally walking up to me and, you know, kind of half telling, half asking, half kind of briefing me on what was going on. I got to the media center, and of course they had every, you know, television in the place tuned onto the, you know, 24-hour cables news networks and CT and CBC Newsnet and so on. And, you know, we're replaying the famous footage again and again and again. And I was kind of stunned. Drove home, the freeways were empty. I remember calling my parents, of course, both very much products of the Cold War. My mother started to cry and says, is there going to be a nuclear war? And I'm going, no, Mom, I think we're in a bit of a different paradigm here. This is, of course, after the US began airstrikes on Afghanistan. Iraq wasn't yet in the picture, but would be in a couple of more years. And so I went to the dean of the Liberal Arts and Science Division and said, you know, I'd kind of like to teach a course on, you know, war and terrorism, kind of, you know, contemporary conflict kind of thing. And she said, that's a great idea. I ended up developing a course, started that January. It is still being taught today at Humber College, more than, I guess, well, coming on 2 decades later.
And had a meeting in Edmonton. So I was in a secure location in Edmonton at the University of Alberta. And my colleague, Tom Weiss, had just flown in, and his wife was in a panic because he was on one of those planes that ended up being grounded in Canada. She didn't know where he was. You know, there was a lot of fear that perhaps, you know, these attacks on New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania could have actually been also carried out on other airlines. So understandable panic on his wife's part. But we had a nice meeting in Edmonton, and he was thrust into the media spotlight because he was from New York. And the media came in to do some interviews with myself and him. And we talked about our own reaction to what was happening that day. The first immediate reaction, of course, was shock and horror that something like this could happen. As you know, there'd never been a major terrorist incident on North American soil until that time. So we always think of in terms of terrorism happening out there in the Middle East, in Palestine, in different parts of Europe, perhaps in Africa, and so on. But to see something like this happen on North American soil and next door to us on the border um, was actually very shocking. So the immediate reaction, I think, was disbelief that something like this would happen. And then, of course, as things settled in, we realized that there were thousands of people killed on that day, including 24 Canadians. Um, Obviously, we became very empathetic and sort of felt the pain that the family members were suffering on that day. So sadness and grief, I think, was probably the second reaction to what happened there. I think also that there was a sense of solidarity, I think, with Americans. I know we tend to be, good friends with the people south of the border, but sometimes we rub against each other, and there are conflicts that sometimes emerge between the two countries. But at that particular moment, I think there was a sense of solidarity, a sense that we should be hanging together with the Americans at this particular point in time. So the fact that that this could have happened also in Canada was not lost on us, and therefore, the reaction was one of support in whatever way we can for our colleagues south of the border. Canada was fairly measured. Obviously, there was a sense of panic. There was a sense of the need to do something immediately in support of the so-called global war on terror. So the Canadian Development of Operations Support, the Canadian Forces would provide support for stranded members of air crews that were stranded in Canada, and for passengers as well that ended up being in Canada, couldn't get back to the States because of the need to protect the airspace. The increase in emergency preparedness, which is something that we were fairly lax on, I think, in the past. The number of measures that were brought in to ensure that passengers traveling from then on would have to sort of have their shoes, for example, checked before going on to to an aircraft. Those kind of changes were sometimes considered to be a little bit inconvenient, but necessary. And I think most Canadians tended to agree with the Canadian government's response to what was happening. In terms of the legislative responses, the Anti-Terrorism Act and the Criminal Code was put in full force to ensure that that these kinds of acts would not happen in Canada. And of course, the need for criminal investigations, making sure that organizations that claim to be, organizations supporting donations, for example, in different parts of the world, were not linked in any way to finances that would finance terrorist organizations. That was very important, I think, a measure for the Canadian government to take. And the Canadian Command, as well as Canada's Border Service Agency, these things were necessary to ensure that Canada's border would be secured. But I think one of the things that happened was that we realized fairly quickly that the global war on terror wasn't going to be won anytime soon, and that maybe that was not the most important problem for Canada when it comes to terrorism. We realize from the Toronto 18 that we can have domestic terrorists brewing in the country. So it was important to deal with our domestic situation as well, because domestic terrorism has become a reality in Canada. And we've seen evidence of this now from white supremacist groups, from groups that are anti-Muslim, in reaction, of course, to 9/11. But this growing need to sort of challenge the Canadian security system domestically, I think, is something that we have to address. I think in that particular case, you know, I think there were obviously some Canadians that were concerned and upset that the Canadian government paid, you know, some money to this person that was considered to be a terrorist as a kid, and it was actually, you know, imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay by the United States. But the reality was that as a person in Edmonton, I think I realized right away that this individual was not a terrorist of his own volition. A lot of it was influenced by his father, and I think we had to be sympathetic to that fact, and the fact that the actions that he carried out, you know, were actions of a young person, and we had to treat him as we would treat any juvenile delinquent in Canada, for example, and give him a chance to rehabilitate himself. We need to be able to understand what their underlying reasons are for that radicalization and try to address those before it turns into something more extreme. And so we have to be a little bit more nuanced in our approach to dealing with terrorism, I believe, and dealing with extremism as opposed to simply radicalization. Terrorism remains a threat, of course, to Canada, as it does to North America now, as we realize. But our biggest challenge comes from domestic terrorism as opposed to external terrorist forces. We can try to sort of harden our border as much as we like, but if the enemy is within, you know, developing all these measures to deal with global terrorism is not going to help us very much. So I think it's important for us to deal with our domestic challenges that come from extremists within the country. And this is one of the things I think that we need to move beyond the reaction to 9/11 and to think about reacting to other incidents of hate, hate speech, social media that's being utilized for this purpose, and the anger that's being generated against people of different religions, people of different color, people of different ethnicities. I think those are the primary challenges that Canada face when it comes to extremism. So we just have to change our way of thinking about this, and I hope that that we'll find a way to, as Canada's always tried to do, to find a measured and balanced way of dealing with the problems of terrorism.
Initially, I thought it had been an airline accident. I think, like a lot of people, when it became evident that it was a deliberate attack, and then that it had been a deliberate terrorist attack, you know, my thoughts were that it had that this was going to change everything internationally and specifically for Canada, and including for the border. It was an attack on the United States. I think it's been very robust. On the one hand, you've had a deepening of cooperation with the United States, both in terms of North American security beyond NORAD, and then the deployment to Afghanistan. So I think relative to other allies, the Canadian response was quite vigorous. It also had internal changing the laws in Canada with regard to dealing with terrorism and public safety. On the other, so you have this increased cooperation with the United States. On the other hand, a more clear delineation of the border, because this was an attack on the United States, although it's generalized as an attack on the West and terrorism was a threat to the West. It was immediately a threat to the United States. Had a similar attack taken place in London or Paris, you know, against the Eiffel Tower or Parliament, you wouldn't have had the same global response that you had, and the Canadian response would have been different. But it made all the difference in the world that this was an attack on the United States. Canada did step forward here, particularly in Afghanistan. And so in these debates that follow about burden sharing on this issue, Canada was step forward and assumed the burden, partly just generally against terrorism, but as because we knew for us, the fact that the border could be closed really, as late Desmond Morton said, that really shook us. And so Canada stepping forward with the smart border plan, you could see Canada taking the initiative.
So on 9/11, I was in the Pentagon. I was in the first day of my second week on the U.S. Joint Staff Strategic Planning and Policy Directorate, which is the nexus between the U.S. military and pretty much everybody else in D.C. and around the world. And I was on the Bosnia desk. And so I was at work at that time. And then somebody came into the office, an Air Force officer, and he turned on the TV and told everybody to watch. And he immediately thought it was terrorism because he was familiar with the flying around New York City since he was a pilot. And we then saw the second plane hit, and all doubts were erased about that assessment. But I still had a meeting to go to. That I had a meeting across the river at the State Department. And so the two Army officers and I got into one of the shuttles that rotate around the city to go from government building to government building. And we were on the bridge between Arlington, Virginia and Washington, D.C. when the Pentagon got hit by that third plane. And we looked behind us. I'm not sure I remember really hearing anything, but I looked behind us and we saw smoke rising. And I thought it was Roslyn, the suburban community near the Pentagon. But the Army officers assured me that it was indeed a Pentagon. And then the radio reaffirmed that a few minutes later. But we had to keep on going because we had passengers that wanted to go to the State Department, that had to go to the State Department. And we had passengers that had to go to the old Executive Office building, which is part of the White House complex. And so I'll always remember being at a street corner watching a man set up a video camera because he was trying to capture that moment where a plane would hit the White House. And so that shook me then, and it has always stayed with me as one of the enduring memories and feelings I have of that day. What are my reactions to the reactions that the United States and Canada have made since 9/11? I think my primary lesson learned is humility. That is that countries and individuals have to ratchet their estimations of what they can accomplish and what they can guess. So for me, I made a lot of assessments that day and later on that I got wrong. And I've realized, for instance, that the use of force is limited, that you can't build things by bombing things, and you can't use the army really to build things, despite what we tried to do in Afghanistan for 20 years. That the United States and Canada both need to figure out how limited the utility of force is. I think that's one of the lessons of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, and then these other interventions, that interventions can work. We see that from Bosnia and Kosovo, but it takes a whole lot of effort, and it really depends on a lot of conditions, and the costs are high, and we should be much more careful about entering into new interventions. So I think that's the first lesson. The second lesson is that in both countries, and I'm more familiar with the American reaction because I was in the United States that year, was to build more national security enterprises. The United States built the Department of Homeland Security and gave more power to the executive to enforce things. And I think in a lot of ways we overreached on that. And now we have government agencies that do some harm rather than doing mostly good. And so that's something we have to rethink. My other reaction is I'm very grateful to all the people involved in this project. Most grateful to Andrea Sharon of Manitoba University. I'm sorry. One of my reactions is I'm most grateful to Andrea Sharon of University of Manitoba for initiating this project, as well as connecting us to many of the people we talked to. We are thankful to a group of students, including Rachel Wallace, Francis Finlayson of Carleton, and Daniel Keisman and Elizabeth St. John of Manitoba, as they helped to arrange the interviews and provide suggestions for the editing. We're thankful to the Social Science Humanities Research Council of Canada for funding the Canadian Defense and Security Network. And finally, and most of all, I'm grateful to Melissa Jennings, the CDSN's Director of Communications, who did all the heavy lifting of this project, including all the editing and putting this whole thing together. So to all these people, I'm very grateful. I think the next thing we ought to do is hope that we don't create more videos like this as we don't have any more major terrorist events that shake us all for a generation. Thank you.